The Renaissance, a period of vast expansion in both knowledge and technology. But as we know, things take time to adapt into society. And this was no exception for European combat between the 14th to 17th centuries, or in this case, the coexistence of knights, and well, actual firearms. But what exactly led to this period in history, and what did combat look like with such a blend of technology? Skipping the origins of gunpowder and early firearms from Chinese history, we are able to trace the first example of firearms in European history to the early 14th century. The pot de fer, or iron pot, was the first gun to be used in a European battle in the city of Metz in 1324, and although the iron pot needed a stand to be used, and well, was more or less a cannon, I thought it was worth including. But of course, the Europeans realized pretty quickly the power that firearms were capable of. And not even 100 years later, and they would have developed handheld versions, which were more practical, but equally ineffective. These early handheld or mounted guns started appearing around the early 15th century, with examples to the likes of the Handrahor, Kulverin, and hand cannon respectively. And although these early models were very limited in effect, they still had their place in combat nonetheless. However, it was not until the latter half of the 15th century and into the 16th century that firearms would really begin to take off. As more effective and usable guns were being created, they became increasingly common on the battlefield. Likewise, however, as guns became more powerful, the once advantageous knights were starting to become obsolete, as they simply couldn't fight how they fought best, hand to hand. But of course, this was only possible with further improvements in the guns themselves. So what exactly did this look like? Namely, the development and production of the arquebus, an early form of long gun, and later, when bullet-resistant armor was produced, the higher caliber musket. Likewise, when the practicality of these guns became an issue for mounted soldiers, smaller handheld versions arose, such as the pistol, which could be easily wielded on horseback. The introduction of these higher caliber and overall more effective guns certainly had their place in combat, such as their decisive use at the Battle of Cerignola, and it is during this century that we were really able to understand how these new firearms shaped different nations. On one side of history, you had the German riders, who boasted the traditional look of thick armor riding on horseback, yet carried the newly developed guns. And on the other, Spanish conquistadors, who resembled a less armored, more modern look. Likewise, it was during the latter half of the 16th century and into the early 17th century that there was a clear blend of traditional warfare amongst these newly developed weapons, which made it not uncommon to find knights and guns on the same battlefields, which is a trend that continued up until the end of the 17th century. Likewise, however, it is between these periods that knights themselves gradually became obsolete, and it became more common to see soldiers who took on appearances more similar to this than the traditional, fully armored knights, and likewise a shift towards the use of firearms. And although knights with guns certainly had their place in history, by the end of the 17th century, they were more or less phased out of existence, with the introduction of more modern forces who were both cheaper to equip and easier to train, such as the Musketeers of the Guard, who were introduced in 1622, or the Harquebusiers, a mounted soldier who exists during the 17th century. Likewise, as mentioned at the beginning of the video, things take time to adapt, and this was no exception for the shift away from knights and towards firearms. Being able to study the impact that firearms had during the Renaissance is quite fascinating. And although firearms weren't the only reason that knights started to become obsolete, it is quite fascinating to see the influence they had in completely revolutionizing combat, demonstrating just how largely one piece of technology can disrupt and likewise shape history. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking and subscribing for future videos. Feel free to comment any additional information or things that I may have missed in the comment section.